Today we're going to be learning Eruvin Daf Nun Chet. It'll also help if you use the sheet, as usual. Okay, we're going to start with the Mishnah at the bottom again. I'll review. It's a little bit of a complicated daf, a little hard to visualize. And one of the complications, as in many dafim, is that there are many different interpretations as to how to understand what the Gemara is saying. So that if you walk out of class feeling a little bit of a lack of clarity, don't feel bad because there's a lot of lack of clarity about what the differences are between the methods. That we're basically going to suggest a number of different methods to use for measuring depending on the situation. And again, it's not 100% clear cut what situation requires what and even what the differences are between the methods. So again, I'll just kind of prepare you with, it's going to be a little bit confusing, not only because it's complicated. It's not even so complicated. It's just that it's not so clear cut what they mean in every case. So I could kind of explain this sugya to you in one reading and just kind of ignore all the others, but I don't really like to do that. So I'll a little bit suggest where there's a little bit of difference of interpretation, even though it might potentially confuse you a little bit, but I always prefer to go with that approach than to kind of make things so clear cut and neat and perfect when they're not so clear cut and neat and perfect. So with that intro, let's get started. And the other thing to kind of give you an idea here is that there's something behind the concept here, which kind of pervades most of the page, which is that we want to make things a little bit simpler for people. Okay, we want to make it easier. We don't want to complicate things too much. On the one hand, if you have to measure and you come up to a mountain or a canyon, it's going to be a little bit complicated to measure. On the other hand, right, so we want you to be able to measure your 2,000 amo directly. On the other hand, it's not always so simple to do that. And the question is, how lenient can we be to make things simpler for you? And there are going to be all different possibilities or levels of how much we can be lenient. And again, it's also a little debatable, some of those things. So we'll start again with the Mishnah. So the first thing is they get all the way down to details, including how long your tape measure should be, basically. So you should use these measures of these ropes of 50 amot. Soon we're going to discuss even what material are they made out of. Okay, that's the extent to which they delve into depth into. Lo pachot v'lo yoter, no more, no less. In the Gemara, they'll explain what's the magic number 50 about. The lo yimdod ela keneged libo. In fact, it was interesting that Amy said at the end of class, she's an architect, and said, wait a minute, why are you measuring against your heart, right? We always measure on the ground. It's the most exact measurement. So Amy, I have an answer for you. The Ritva, okay, actually says on the sugya, I'll read it inside and then I'll explain, Perush. Kol sheba limdo bikarka mamash ha'adif tfei. If you're going to bend down on the ground and measure on the ground, that's obviously the best way to go. So there you have it, Amy. He says specifically, that's the best way to measure. Obviously, you're measuring from the ground. Okay, we don't mean that you're measuring in the air here, but he says, okay, he says that's the best way to measure. But if, okay, now I'll explain why you would think that maybe someone would be measuring there. Again, what did I say? There's this need to be lenient, right? We're going to be lenient. We don't make you bend all the way down. Let's say your back isn't great and you don't want to bend down on the floor. If that's the case, then you can do it keneged libo. And then basically, again, back to what we said yesterday, that the idea is if I do it against my heart and you do it against your heart, then otherwise I'll do it against my heart, you'll do it against your leg, and then the whole thing will be uneven. So that's what he says, but it's not everybody agrees with him. Some people say, no, it's specifically keneged libo, but the Ritva does say what you said. So I wanted to bring that, or you said what the Ritva said. So there you have it. Next, higia legai. So now that's very easy, but what if, while you're there, all of a sudden you get to a canyon, or to some sort of fence, which some people say it was a stone fence that now broke, and you now end up with this pile of rubble. Mavli'o. Okay, so there's going to be two ways that you can do lahavliya. One option is to just one person stand on one side, the other person stand on the other, and they take this straight line and they basically go across. That will work very well for a canyon. If it's something that's higher, then, okay, and I'll show you a picture from today. They don't show it there, but they show it further on here. If it's higher, then you basically take two poles. This is, again, some people interpret this as what you do. You take two poles, you put the rope in between the two poles, and you hold it over the hill or the mound of stones or whatever it is, and that's how you measure above. But if it's too wide, right, and then you can't, so what do? So mavli'o v'chozer l'midato, okay, we're going to now say, when it says mavli'o, what they probably mean is that this is what we discussed yesterday, you go outside, you basically, let's say you can't cross over the canyon, it's wider than 50, or you can't get over that hill. So what do? Maybe it's too high, or again, too wide, and you'd have to have it that one could stand on one side and hold the 50, and the other could stand on the other. So the first thing to understand about mavli'o is we're not taking into consideration the uphill or the downhill, the slope. The slope is not part of the measurement. That's the first important thing to say. That's the first big leniency here. Now we're going to say more than that, and this they're really only going to explain in the Gemara, but I'll already tell you, it doesn't really explain so well, but what does it mean, mavli'o v'chozer l'midato? They're going to say, and then you go back to your original measuring spec. So it must mean you leave where you are. Let's say there's a canyon in the middle. So you go off to the side, you measure a parallel space. You say, oh, here, I just walked in a straight line. Now I'm going to go the direction I was going in before. And then you come back, chozer l'midato, you come back once you pass where the canyon was, or the hill, then you come back to your spot and you continue your measuring from there. So again, all you take it either which way, all you take into consideration is the space it covers and not the depth or the slope going up. Higia lahar, same thing. If you get to a hill, mavli'o v'chozer l'midato. But here comes, as long as when you're measuring on the side there, you're not in a space that's not part of the tchum. And that we said yesterday, and we're going to see it in the Gemara today, which is so that people don't think when they see you measuring there, they'll think it's part of the tchum. So you can't do it if that's the case. So now, so let's say you can't, okay? Either it's too wide and you can't get there, or you can't go off to the side because it's outside the tchum, or maybe it's right. It's not an option. So what do? We actually saw this once before. It's a little tricky to understand exactly how they do this, but it's not so tricky. But we'll see in the Gemara, they're going to explain it later, but I'll already tell you because it's impossible. They only tell you at the end what this means. It's impossible to understand it if we don't explain it. So here's our picture 215. Picture number 215. You basically have one person stands at the bottom of the mountain, holds the rope by his heart. The next person, right, then the rope goes to the feet of the person in front of him. Then that person picks up the rope, holds it, right? Holds it and now connected his lave. The other person in this picture, you see there's a lot of people, but maybe it's the same two people and they just keep switching off. And you basically go up the mountain in this manner. Okay. There's a big debate about whether if you do it in this way, is this different from havla'ah, or it's called in English, piercing the mountain. What does it mean to pierce the mountain? So it basically means that in essence, we're trying to basically bear a hole straight through the mountain and end up with a straight line. It's the same idea as havla'ah. We're not getting anything on the slope here. We're just trying to measure. And in fact, you see here, we're only going to see this later, that Abaye says you use ropes of 4 cubits here. You don't use the 50 cubit ones, because if you use the 50 cubit ones, what's going to happen? It's going to be way too long, right? You're going to end up, if one's holding it there and one's holding it there, the slope is going to get into part of the calculation. If you do it with 4, it's a little more exacting, and then you won't include the slope so much. However, not everyone agrees that it's a chevel of 4 amot. Some people say you use the 50. And then one of the differences between havla'ah and mikadrin is that when you do this mikadrin, you actually do somewhat include the slope. And there's no way when you do it like this, you're not going to have, what's the issue if you measure the slope? Well, then you're not going to be piercing the mountain 100%, right? You're going to end up with a little extra measurement. So let's say the space from one side of the mountain to the other is 80 amot. You're going to end up measuring maybe 85 or 90 because you're adding some of the slope into the equation. So many people think that mikadrin does include some of the slope, whereas lahavliya includes nothing of the slope. Many people believe that mikadrin does somehow include some of the slope. It's not like you're intending to, but by doing it in this way, you're going to end up somehow adding a bit of the slope into your measuring, which is going to end up being kind of stringent because in the end, your 2,000 cubits is going to end earlier. Okay, so now the Gemara asks the following question: where do we get this from, this 50 amot of the rope? So this is a good example of, we're going to see this a lot in today's daf, that there's certain measurements we keep talking about, four cubits. Like, why did they choose 4 cubits for the rope, right? It's because 4 cubits is a measurement that we know, right? When we always stick to known measurements. It's kind of like when they have midrashim and they have, the two people fighting in the desert. Oh, it must have been Datan and Aviram, because we see them doing other things, right? They always want to connect things. So here also, we have certain measurements. 2,000 cubits, you're going to see comes up a lot, even though it is not necessarily talking about Tchum Shabbat in a particular context. We're going to see here today, they talk about the depth. What if the depth is more than 2,000? Now, they use the numbers that they're used to. And here we're going to go back to the 50 by 100. Where do we know 50 by 100? Which are also numbers that are going to come up more in today's daf. That's from the courtyard of the Mishkan, which we discussed yesterday, which was 50 by 100, which is also the same as 70 2/3 by 70 2/3. So now we're going to say, this is where we get that the rope should be 50 amot, because the Chatzir was 50. Okay, now why would we learn it from there? Well, we're going to see. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, and this should sound somewhat familiar to you. Damar Cha Orech HaChatzir Mea Ba'ama. It says in the pasuk there that the courtyard was 100 amal in length, Rochav 50 b'chamishim, and the width was 50 in 50, 50 by 50. That's very strange. It wasn't 50 by 50. It was 50 by 100, 100 by 50. So what's this b'chamishim? Remember, we had this before. Amra Torah b'chevel shel chamishim ama medod. The extra word 50 is coming to teach you, use 50, right? That's your measurement for this rope, even though that was talking about the courtyard of the Mishkan, right? It's just an extra word. We don't know what to do with it. So we say it's to come and teach us this. So Amra Torah b'chevel shel chamishim ama medod, measure with a chevel of 50. So now the Gemara asks, wait a minute. Hi mibayle litol chamishim u'lesavev chamishim. Don't we need that for something else? And that's why I said we already learned this, but we learned this not to teach us about the rope. We actually darshan this pasuk to mean something else. There's rules about darshaning pasukim. You can't take one word and learn two different things from it. And we already learned a different halacha. What halacha did we learn? We learned the halacha of a karpaf, a space that is not has walls, but it's an open space that has walls, but it's not surrounded for the purposes of living. And then we learned that if it's, what do? They said, here, we'll read it. Litol chamishim u'lesabev chamishim. What it means is your 100 by 50 space, we're going to view it as if there's one square of 50, and then take the other square of 50, and two squares of 50 by 50, take the other square and move it and surround the other 50 with it, meaning basically, in other words, square off the 50, and you get to 70 2/3. And that's the measurement for a karpaf that has walls that weren't surrounded for the purposes of living. If it's smaller than 70 2/3, you could still carry within that. It's not forbidden by Torah law, unless it has, right? It's only going to be forbidden. Actually, I think it's all rabbinic. It's only going to be forbidden if it's more than 70 2/3. Okay. So that's what we learned from there. So we can learn from there that the rope is supposed to be 50. So what do they say? Oh, no, you can, because there could have been other ways to work. So Im ken lemakra chamishim chamishim. It should have said 50-50, and then you'd know what we wanted to say. So my chamishim b'chamishim. Why did it add also the word chamishim and also the bet before the word chamishim? Okay, one can debate whether grammatically, right? This method is not always grammatical. Okay, it could be grammatically incorrect. You wouldn't necessarily say chamishim anyway. But basically, they say the fact that it has the word chamishim and it has the letter bet, then already we can say shmat minat tarte. We can learn two things from this verse, both about the rope and about the size of a karpaf when it's square. Lo pachot v'lo yoter. So now why not more than 50 or why not less than 50? So first we wanted to learn it all from a verse, to have some sort of reference in a verse. Again, it's not that the verse really meant that, it's just a way of connecting it to some pasuk. But now we want to know, why is that number so important? Tana, so in a Braita, it explains, Lo pachot mipnei shemarbeh, v'lo yoter mipnei shemema'et. If you have something shorter, it might end up, if two people pull something that's very short, they'll end up stretching it because it's short, so they can hold it easily and pull it. So it might end up becoming longer than the amount. If it's more than 50, then what will happen? It will sag. And if it sags, right, it's more likely it'll sag. Once it sags, then obviously you're going to end up with a smaller measurement than the actual measurement. That's why they decided 50 was the perfect number where it won't sag, right? That's where we cross the line between it won't stretch and it also won't sag. Amar Rabbi Asi. Now the question is going to be, what type of material do we use for the rope? Ein modidin ela b'chevel shel afsakima. Okay, that doesn't really help us. We don't know what afsakima is, and lo and behold, they didn't know what afsakima was either. So the Gemara asks, my afsakima? Amar Rabbi Abba nargila. So Rabbi Abba says it's nargila. Okay, that doesn't help us either, and in fact, it didn't help them either. My nargila, what is nargila? Amar Rabbi Yaakov Dikla dechad navra. It's the fibers of the palm tree. Okay, so we're going to take the fibers of a palm tree, make a rope out of them, and that's what we're going to use. Igad Amre, some people read this a little bit differently, that it went like this, the conversation. Ma'af Sakima, Rabbi Abba Amar Nargila, Rabbi Yaakov Amar Dikla dechad navra. One said it was a nargila, and one said it was the fibers of a decal tree. We don't really know what nargila is, but you end up with that it's two different things. It's maybe an nargila, maybe it's these fibers. I see someone wrote that it's fibers of a vine that grows around the palm trees. I thought it was the fibers of the palm tree. Right, you're right. Rashi says, Siv shegadelu mitgalgel sviv hadekel. Okay, like Rashi says it's like gfanim. It's not. I think it's the fibers of the tree that grow around the tree like a vine grows. I think it doesn't mean fibers up. It's fibers that grow like a vine. Don't think Rashi means that it's actually of a vine. Because we all know there's fibers around the palm tree. We always talk about those. So that's what I think they mean here. Okay, moving on. So now we're going to talk about different ropes. Tanya. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Hananya. He says, wait a minute. The best thing really to use is a metal, barzel, iron. That's a much stronger material. It's much better. But what can we do? Because it's biyado chevel midah. It says in a pasuk in the Torah. It's not really the Torah. It's Zechariah in the Nevi'im. It says, okay, it starts talking about the Sinai. He sees a vision. Zechariah saw a lot of these visions. I see a person, and in his hands is a chevel midah. So the type of measuring implement we see in the Torah is a rope. So from there we learn it has to be a rope and not some metal chain. But wait a minute, there's another verse. Where's this verse? This is a verse from Yechezkel, where it says they're talking about the walls of the city of Jerusalem, and they measured, okay, and we'll see in a minute, they're talking about the measuring for the gates. Ubiyad ha'ish knei hamidah. In the hands of the person, there was a measuring implement. This could mean anything. So it could mean it was also made of a metal implement. There you see in the Torah, it doesn't only say chevel, a rope. So they say, oh no, that's different. Hahu litari, that's for gates. When you're measuring for a gate, that's a very small space. And here again, I think that they're trying to be lenient on people. If they made us carry these metal chains that were 50 amot long, that would be very heavy and very unpleasant to do. So therefore, again, a leniency. Next. Now we're going to see that not everyone agreed that you use this afsakima. Okay, we're going to see Tani Rav Yosef, Shlosha Chavalim Hem. There's 3 different types of ropes that we use for different mitzvot. Shel Magag, Shel Netzer, V'Shel Pishtan. Okay, there's bulrush of Netzer, which is, right, I think the Netzer, one second, I saw different interpretations, right? Either it's from the Arava, okay, like we use now for Chag Sukkot from the Arava tree, or like fibers from there, or maybe also these fibers from the palm tree, okay, or peeled willow branches. Unclear exactly what it is, but something very similar to what we were discussing. Vishel pishtan and flax. But now we're going to see we don't use the netzer for our purposes. It's used for something else. Shel magag lepara. The magag was used for the para. How do we get that? Because, okay, what's the para? The para aduma, the red heifer. Titnan, kaptua bechevel hamagag unitanua al gav marachta. When they went to burn, okay, there's actually a debate here, whether the marechet is where they would burn it. That was later. They would burn the para aduma, so they would tie it down with rope. Some people say they would tie it before they slaughtered it. So debate again about where exactly they use this rope, but at some point they tied down the para aduma, the red heifer, and they tied it down with, it says it in the Mishnah explicitly, with bulrush. Nitzarim l'sota, the sota. Okay, where does the sota get tied? We're going to see in a minute. Ditnan va'achar kach mevi chevel hamitzri v'koshro l'mala midadeha. They would, okay, very unpleasant. One of the things they did that embarrassed the sota was that they took the sota and they ripped her clothes, which became this big embarrassment because, women especially, they didn't want their clothes not on. So they would immediately tie them with this rope. Okay, and they would use, you'll see in a minute, so above her breast, they would tie the clothes after they tore them. Okay, we'll get to sota, we have time. Okay, we'll deal with that whole topic when we get there. But they would tie it with a chevel hamitzri. Some people say, why chevel hamitzri? Some people say it's just the material. That's what it was called, the Egyptian Egyptian rope. It was a certain material, right, which obviously was from these nitzarim. But some people say specifically from Mitzrayim because they always talk about the toavot of Mitzrayim and the women and the licentious behavior. So they say, they wanted to remind her, here, look, you're acting like an Egyptian. Okay, which again, if you say maybe she's innocent, not so nice, but again, they suspected her and therefore they already put her in a certain category at this point. Shel pishtan lemidida. Now here you see his disagreement. He says they were made of flax. Oh, I forgot to mention something important. Why did they use bulrush for the paran? They didn't use, let's say, flax or wool. The reason is because those are susceptible to impurities. In the paraduma, they had to be super careful never to get anything impure. Now, even though the flax or wool in their raw form, which would be ropes, aren't susceptible to impurity, but in other forms, once you spin them, then they become susceptible to impurity. Therefore, they wanted to just steer far away from them and use something that is not at all potentially even susceptible to impurity. Okay. Hayam moded v'higia. So now we're back to the Mishnah. Okay, that was in a bit of a side. That was the simpler part, I would say, of our daf. Now we get to the more complicated part to understand when we use lahavliya, when we use mekadrim, what are these things? How do they work? So again, this part we already explained, which is just hayam moded v'higia, and then it said if you're measuring and then you get to a guy or a gader, you get to a canyon or a fence or a hill, mavli ov chozer l'midato. It didn't really explain it well, even though I already explained it, but I explained it based on this. So here the Gemara tells you midatani chozer l'midato, because it says then you go back to your original space. From there, it seems to imply michlal. From here, you can apply to ime no yachol lahavlio if you can't put the rope from one side to the other because it's too wide. This is where I said there's two ways of doing it, and that's implied in the Mishnah. Then you go to some parallel space where you can measure the exact same measurement. And then you basically measure that space. And then sofeh, you're constantly looking back to say, can I go back to my original spot? And if already the canyon is finished and you can go back to your original spot, you go back. So that's what it means. You look all the time to keep looking back to see, can I go back to my original spot? And as soon as you can, the chozer, you go back and you continue your measuring from there. And in fact, this inference that we made from the Mishnah can be found explicitly in a braita. That's what it means. Tanina lahadetanu rabbanan. We can find this explicitly stated in a braita. Hayam moded v'higia hamida legai im yachol lahavlio. So you were measuring and you got to a canyon. If you can measure it b'chevel shel chamishim amah, if you can. Each person stand on either side and measure 50. Perfect. Mavli'o ve'im lav. And if you can't, holech l'makom she'achol lavli'o u'mavli'o v'tzofeh v'chozer l'midato. It's basically, we said in the Mishnah, it's just the Mishnah said it much shorter and it wasn't so clear that that's what we meant, even though, because I explained it, it was pretty clear, but I explained it based on the way the Gemara says it here. Now the Braita continues. Im haya gai me'ukam. And now we're going to deal with the continuation. If the canyon, instead of, we just imagine you're walking and the canyon is a straight line, let's say it goes east-west and you're walking north. So you go further north on the side, right? You go out to the west, let's say, and you go further north and then you go back to the middle and you walk. But what if the canyon curves and then basically you can't go off to the side to go measuring because it's all curved there and the canyon still is continuing there. So what do you do then? Okay, this is classic of the Gemara. They're describing all sorts of, not so simple situations that could come up. So if it was a gai me'ukam, again, I can already tell you there's some other interpretations of gai me'ukam, but we'll stick with this one. So then you use mekadrin. You basically have to go into the canyon. There's no choice. Okay, just like we said on the mountain, you go in and you keep measuring little bits and pieces on the incline. So that's what you do here. But higia lekotel, if you got up to a wall and there was a wall blocking your way from going, you don't have to try to kind of figure out. Now, what would you do? You can't really make a yikov sounds like you make a hole. You obviously don't make a hole. But what would it mean, yikov kotel? Either you have to do mekadrin, right? You have to climb up, or you have to take really tall poles to get above, right? The way we said there's two poles with the rope on it. When it's a wall, we don't make you do that. Okay? Ela, omdova holechlo. Here we come to a real leniency. You just estimate how wide do you think this wall is and move on. Okay? You can just estimate. So now the Gemara is going to obviously ask, but didn't we say you go around it or you go above it? And what do you mean? If we have a hill, you do this. Why do you do it with a hill and you don't do it for a wall? So they say, there's a difference between a wall and a hill. Ha tam nicha tashmishta. Ha lo nicha tashmishta. For this, we have a picture. So when you have a hill, look at the picture. So when you have a hill, since it goes up a little and then goes down a little, so it's comfortable, people can walk on it. It's sloped, but you can walk on it. People don't generally walk on walls, okay, right? Maybe this week we're all stuck at home in Israel anyway, people are climbing the walls, but generally you don't climb the walls, right? You usually wouldn't do that. So because of that, we don't make you climb over the wall or somehow bypass the wall. But if it's something that's a hill, which you would generally, it is, a lot of people walk up hills, if there's a mound in the middle of the road, you'll climb up it and go down it. So therefore we make you do it. Now, again, we start with another line that's not so clear, but I'm going to tell you that the way I'm going to read this is according to Rashi. Okay, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Lo shanu ela she'ein chut hamishkolet yored kenegdo. Okay, chut hamishkolet is a plumb line. Okay, it's basically a string with a weight at the end that people throw down, let's say, into a canyon. That's our case, to see if it falls straight down or does it fall out, right? And then you can determine, is the wall vertical or is it sloped? So they say here, this whole thing that we've been talking about. Now, what's this whole thing? It's not so clear what he's referring back to. So Rashi says he's referring back to the case of mikadrin. When we make you go in, right, and go down and do it angled, okay, in the canyon, that's only in the case she'ein chut hamishkolet yored kenegdo. It's only if it's enough sloped that when you put the plumb line down, it doesn't go straight down, but it angles out, right? It doesn't reach the bottom there, right near where you are, and it's not a vertical line. Aval chut hamishkolet yored kenegdo. What if it's straight vertical line down? Then we're going to go to the next picture in 217. Then we're going to make you go down into the canyon. And I don't know how you're getting into the canyon. Okay, let's assume it's not that deep that you can get in. And you measure midida yafa. Okay, in this case, midida yafa basically means you're going to measure the bottom of, right, the ground in there, where basically means you're just going to measure the space. You're not going to, now this is why people think that mikadrin seems to include an incline somehow. And what we're basically saying is the wall is vertical enough that your plumb line goes all the way down now. You can see from the picture, we're only going to get to this later on in the daf, but I'll already tell you because it's in the picture, it means at a distance of 4 cubits from where you're standing, okay? It doesn't have to go straight down exactly where you're standing, but if it goes out about 4 cubits, you can see this wall is not totally vertical. It goes out a little bit, but only 4 cubits out and then goes straight down. Then already we're going to view this as if the slope is not important at all. And you just basically measure, you go down into the canyon, you measure from one side to the other, and you ignore the slope entirely. Vikama omko shel gai. Okay, so now again, there's a bit of a question. What's this referring to? How deep can the valley be? I see that's your question, Gita. How deep can this canyon be? Okay, now, some people say that this is back to the issue of havla'ah. Well, we want to just basically cut across, right? And just say we're not measuring it all the depth. Maybe it's also including this mikadrin. How deep can it be? Do we say at a certain depth already, you have to start considering the slope because it's so deep? You have to count the wall and how deep it goes down. So Amar Rav Yosef Alpayim. Again, I told you we're going to get back to our classic measurements, and in general, this whole section is going to just measure. There's going to be debates, and they're all going to just pull out one of our magic numbers that we're using. Like they don't say Elef Amah, right? Even though Elef is used a little bit, but it's not used so much in this context. So he says, as long as it's not 2,000 cubits deep, it's fine. Once it's 2,000 cubits deep, then already you have to start counting the wall that goes down. Abaye questions him and says, wait a minute, there's a braita that says, Amok mea v'rochav chamishim mavlio v'im lav e mavlio. And this is why it seems like it's talking about havla'ah. So if it's 100 deep and 50 wide or long, then you do havla'ah. But if not, meaning if it's deeper than 100, then e mavliim. And Rav Yosef said 2,000. That's a huge difference. This seems to say once it's deeper than 100, already you can't do havla'ah. So we just answer simply, Huda Amar Ka'achirim. He holds like a different Tanaitic opinion. And here we're going to see it. Tanya Acherim Omrim. Others say, Afilu Amok Alpayim Verochav Chamishim Mavlio. Here you have it explicitly. As long as it's not more than 2,000 deep, you can still do Havla'ah. Rav Yosef must have held like that. That's the first reading of this sugya. But there's a second reading. Ika da Amre, some people say, Amar Rav Yosef, that Rav Yosef said, Afilu Yeter Me'alpayim, even more than 2,000. So now, if he says more than 2,000, now we're really stuck because Rav Yosef is an Amora. He has to fit in with some Tanaitic opinion. One said 100 deep and one said 2,000 deep. So He said more than 2,000. So Kiman, de lo katanakama velo ka'acherim. Now he doesn't seem to hold like anybody. So they say, oh no. Hatam, the debate between the Tanaim was not the same case as he was talking about. Hatam, the debate between the Tanaim was she'en chut hamishkolet yored kenegdo. It's when it was sloped and the plumb line didn't go straight down. Then we're going to determine when do we consider the slope, right? That we have to start counting it. That depends on how deep it is, either 100 or 2,000. But Rabbi Yosef, is talking about bechut hamishkolet yored kenegdo. If it's a straight vertical line down, then we don't care how deep it is. Even more than 2,000 deep, you're still going to only go across, basically, and you're not going to count the wall at all because it's not sloped. The whole idea is, do we count the slope? We don't have to count the slope if there's no slope, basically. And then it doesn't matter. We don't care how deep it is. So now they say, okay, wait. So now going back to what I said was in this picture, which is when we're talking about the chut hamashkolet. So how far away from you can it be that we still consider it got to the bottom right near you? So ad kama amar Avimi arba. Arba. He says as long as within 4 amot it goes down to the floor, that's fine. Higia lahar mavli'o v'chozer lemidato. Okay, now we're back to this idea about the har. If you have a hill, so what do? Again, we do mavli'a. So either we go outside, right, a parallel spot, or we go up across the top using these poles and the rope. So now, again, we're going to have a limitation of this. And we're going to have 2 different versions of what Rava says. The first one, Rava is going to be more stringent, and the second one is going to be more lenient. Amar Rava, lo shanu ela bahar mitlaket 10 mitoch 4. That's only, okay, now again, we're going to talk about how much of a slope. And this is a measurement we saw when we were talking about carrying on Shabbat, about places like in Rashid or Rabim. If it starts going up, you have a mound, and it's 10 tefachim tall, 4 wide. The question is, though, how sloped is it? If you remember, we talked about if it's a very narrow, it slopes very slowly. Then even if it gets up to 10 tefachim, because the incline is so slight that you don't really feel it, then basically we're going to say it's as if you're on the ground still. So the same thing is what he's going to say here. So lo shanu ela, and it's the same measurements we brought there. Ela bahar mitlaket 10, goes up 10 mitoch 4, as you go a distance of 4 cubits. Ava bahar mitlaket 10 mitoch 5 amot. If you're going to basically, it's going to take you 5 cubits until you get to a height of 10. Modido medida yafa. Then basically you're just going to measure that incline, and basically that means, right, if your incline, if it ends up going up and then back down, you're going to end up, instead of measuring a straight line, you're going to end up with more. Because imagine, right, you go like this, you have to go up and then down. That's going to be obviously longer than if you just made a straight line. So in that case, you're going to end up being more stringent. Okay, that's Rav. But comes Rav Huna Bereda Rav Natan Matne Lekula. He teaches what Rava said actually to be more lenient. And this is what he says. Amar Rava, lo shanu ela bahar hamitlaket 10 mitoch 5. No, specifically when we said that you can do havla'ah and skip it, right? That's when we say if it's 10, right? It goes up 10 and it's already 5. It's going to be 5. Sorry, you're going to cover a distance that goes up 10 in a space of 5 cubits. Ava bahar mitlaket 10 mitoch 4 omdova holechlo. Ha! This is a huge kula. Remember with the wall, we said, oh, you could just estimate. He says the same thing here. If it starts going up 10 and the slope is high, then you can just estimate it. Meaning we don't make you, because it's a pain in the neck to figure out, right? It's a high slope. We don't want a deep slope. We don't want it to make you go up that steep area. So we allow you just to estimate. Okay. That's again, a big leniency. So that's one version of Rava, the 2 versions of Rava. Now we're getting back to the Mishnah. As long as when you go out of that area and measure in the parallel space, as long as you're not measuring in a space that's already outside the tchum that's allowed on Shabbat. My time. So what's the reason? People will see you measuring the tchum there. They'll think that that space is outside of tchum, is inside the tchum Shabbat, and it's really not. So you have to be careful. And now we get to the how do you do makadrin, which we already learned, but now we're going to see it in a braita. Tanu Rabanan. I told you in the beginning, they're only going to get to this at the end. Ketzam makadrin Tachton keneged libo, the bottom guy stands with the rope by his heart. Elyon keneged margalotav, the one standing higher up on the mountain is going to position it up to his legs. Amar Abaye, and Abaye tells us, Naktina, we have a tradition, he's the one who says you only use a rope that's 4 amot for this. Okay, whereas I told you, other people think 50, but he says 4. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Ravua, Naktina, we have a tradition, the only time we allow this, again, I told you this is the theme of today. We're very lenient when it comes to Erev Tchumen, and this must be all based on the fact that we believe Erev Tchumen is D'Rabbanan. Remember, we saw there's a machloket. Is it D'Rabbanan? Is it D'Oraita? This seems to hold it's only rabbinic in nature, and that's why we allow all these leniencies of mikadrin, of, right, that we try to kind of pierce the mountain, and we don't take into consideration the incline. Maybe we do a little bit, only slightly. We can estimate sometimes. That's all because these laws are D'Rabbanan. But if it's Torah law, like Egla Rufa, when you have a dead body and you need to measure, you don't know who killed the person, and you measure the 2 closest cities, and then one has to do the whole Egla Rufa procedure where they break the neck of the Egel, and they say, Yadenu lo shafcha dam zeh, we aren't responsible for this. So there you measure the 2, you try to measure to the closest city. There you can't do mikadrin. There you have to take into consideration the slope, you have to measure it. Also, arei miklat, when it comes to protecting the person, right? We said you have space also outside the city. Where do we measure the borders? So when we measure the borders, we also take into consideration the incline, because there we have to be stringent. Okay, new Mishnah. Okay, just maybe we should review just for a quick minute before we move on. So again, we saw that there's havla'ah, there's ways of doing it by just making a straight line, ignoring the canyon or the whatever's in the way, right? And you maybe use poles. If you can't do that, you go out and you do it in a parallel spot and then go back to where you can and do it. Sometimes we allow estimation, like if there's a wall in your way, okay? If there's a guy akum, right? Then also there we allow, what do we say there? I have to remember, if it was a guy akum, then we say, second, guy akum, then you, right? There are certain cases where we also do mikadrin there, okay? So when do we allow mikadrin? Or we tell you have to do mikadrin if you can't go over. You can't do havla'ah. In those cases, we make you do mikadrin, whether it's a gaya akum or it's a mountain that you can't basically get over with havla'ah, or you can't go, you end up outside the tchum if you have to measure it. So there we do this mikadrin, where again, it seems like it must take into account a little bit of the slope, so it's a little bit more stringent. And then we saw that there were cases, according to Rava, if the slope is so steep, then maybe we don't even make you do mikadrin, and then maybe, according to one reading of Rava, we basically allow you just to estimate. Okay, so there were all different possibilities here, but that's a basic review. Okay, now the new Mishnah says, Eimo didin element mumche. The person who measures has to be an expert in measuring. Okay, you can't just be a lay person. What if your line that he draws isn't straight? Okay, it's a little wider in one spot than the other. So what do we say? Because this is all D'Rabbanan, we always are more lenient. We go by the place where it's wider. We're going to have to see in the Gemara what this means, because it seems very similar to the line before, where one is wider, one is narrower. We go by the wider one. Even a servant, okay, this is an Eved Knaani, a Canaanite slave, who basically has a Brit Milah, right? They become like a pseudo, partly Jewish. So they, okay, or a maidservant, they are believed to say this is the tchum generally, and this gets into the whole issue we're going to get into of testimony. Gefet this week, Rabbi El Shimoni is on this. I forgot to mention that Daf Mishalahen is about the persona of Rav Ashi, who was mentioned in the Gemara a few times this week. So basically, they say here that in this kind of case, we allow testimony that's normally not accepted in court to say, this is the end of the Tchum Shabbat. We trust them on this issue. There's certain situations where testimony that's not always admissible will be used for certain things, and that will be a discussion we will get into. Anyway, we'll stop here for today. This ends the Mishnah and ends the Daf, and we'll pick up tomorrow. Everyone. Enjoy your Chag.